time to get all set up and then we can get going.
Sure. You can hear me okay?
Hear you great. See your wonderful background.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. Welcome to our discussion of the Battle of Algiers. I am very happy to be joined by Paul Wright, who suggested this film and made a wonderful and wide-ranging and insightful introduction that I hope you had a chance to watch. If you didn't, you'll be able to find it on our website, and I think it's definitely even worth seeing after this discussion because he really pulls in a lot of great threads. Paul, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And Paul, thank you so much for suggesting this film and for all of the work you've done over the last several months. You've really been a wonderful part of this program, and thank you.
My pleasure.
For those of you who might be new to our discussion, I would ask you to please keep yourself muted, keep your audio on mute until I call on you with your question or comment. I will know that you have a question or comment to share because you will use the little raise hand function within Zoom. And then after I call on you and you ask your question or make your comment, please remute, and Paul mostly will, and I a bit, will respond to your questions and comments. In addition, we hope you will participate in the chat. My colleague Jill will be monitoring the chat. We would love to hear in there where you're from, if you're from outside the greater Philadelphia area. And if you want to drop us a real note with some feedback or other information about where you're from or how you found us, please visit the Where in the World page in the Film Studies Online section of brynmarfilm.org. We've got folks joining us from all over the country and even outside off the continent even. So who knows where folks are from, and it's always great to hear. Okay, I see we have some hands up, and I think we are ready to get started. So why don't we start off, as we so often do, with David.
Good evening. And Dr. Wright, Paul, I think we feel like friends among this whole group. This is certainly a very different movie, at least from my perspective, than most of them. I have a couple of comments and then I guess a question or two. I'm just at the age where I actually remember some of the commentary of the Battle of Algiers and John Kennedy's putting his finger on the scale, or trying to. So, you know, when I was watching this, I was trying to remember my, I guess I'll call it mid to late childhood in that regard. And I guess one of the questions is, Paul, from your perspective afterwards, did the French really learn anything? You know, when we watch the movie and we think back on history, I at least still have a question as to that. And I was amazed at the budget that in 1966, with all of this action, all of these people, all of these scenes, the budget was $800,000. Appreciate any of your comments with regard to some of the things in history that were, I think, mostly accurately, but if you know of any otherwise. And I didn't hear any mention of the United States role and Kennedy's role, and if you know any background on that. And again, thank you.
Thank you for the great question. Couple of things here. First of all, there was one error in my remarks online. If you haven't had a chance to look at them yet or listen to them yet, I hope they might prove helpful. I indicated the film came out in '65. It really came out in '66. It was certainly in production up to that point. Your reference to JFK is interesting here because it raises the larger question of world opinion and world reaction to what was going on between the French and the Algerians. And part of what complicated that, and I think I alluded to this in the video, is a matter of terminology. And as we know, words can sometimes be very powerful and very important. The French were technically considering Algeria to be French Algeria, and they called it a department, which means it's part of metropolitan France as far as they're concerned. That's a perhaps useful fiction ultimately, and eventually a useless fiction, because nobody failed to appreciate that this was really a colonial situation and a colonial oppression. Certainly by 1962, all parties had to recognize that. The response of Kennedy in the US, I'm not super familiar with. What the film does for sure, though, is allude to the importance of world opinion in the role of the leader of the movement, whom they have to smuggle into the Casbah at one point to confer with the heads of the FLN, the revolutionary movement. And this one leader that they are trying to protect is someone who's able to go before the United Nations and actually make the case for Algerian independence and to claim that Algerians are being mistreated by the French in every way. So that larger geopolitical, diplomatic dimension is something the movie touches on. You also raised a great question. I don't know that I have the answer. Did the French learn anything? Arguably, they hadn't learned from Indochina, and they didn't learn a ton in Algeria, except by the hard way. What you do notice in the course of the conflict among French intellectuals, French politicians, the French military, is that the unity they once had in resisting the Nazis in the French resistance, right, under de Gaulle's leadership, that unity basically evaporated in the post-war environment. And you had all kinds of folks who had been fighting Nazis and even had fought in Indochina, for example, some of whom were saying the lesson here is we can't be involved in this kind of colonial enterprise anymore. It will only besmirch France's name and honor and make hypocrites of all of us. And others, of course, were on the opposite end of the spectrum, the hardcore rightists, who basically felt, you know, we already lost Indochina, we can't lose another foothold like Algeria, and we go down fighting no matter what. And that group initially thought that de Gaulle would back them in that, and to their disappointment, he ended up being quite the pragmatist who said, we have to talk with the FLN, we have to make a kind of final accommodation, or this will never end. And that did not please the members of the so-called OAS, who eventually tried to have de Gaulle killed and who firebombed the first cinema in Paris where the film was shown. The larger question, I think maybe you didn't put it this way, I'll put it this way, is not just did the French learn anything, but has anyone learned anything from the French? This film, you might have heard in the 2000s, was shown by the State Department and others as a way of thinking through what was going on in Iraq, kind of in the spirit of Colin Powell's statement, if you break it, you buy it, right? The Pottery Barn analogy. And to what extent Algiers was an appropriate analogy to what was going on in Iraq is a big question. But folks felt there was something to be learned from the movie and to be learned from the French and Algerian experiences. But what people really put into practice from that learning remains to be seen.
But the FLA actually learned a lot of their technique from the Israelis and the Irgun while the British were there. I mean, when I was watching this, it was so much like that time frame, and the same, you know, against the Europeans, and you know, that guerrilla warfare just absolutely won. Yeah, this is something I've actually been teaching about in some of my courses more and more, which is the defining characteristic of modern conflict being asymmetrical conflict. And I didn't invent that. I mean, that's a fundamental premise of insurgency and counterinsurgency theory going back to the mid-20th century. But if you look at the major conflicts around the globe since, you know, after World War II, the great majority of them reflect asymmetric conflict, not only in terms of asymmetries in power, but also asymmetries in means and methodologies, and also asymmetries in goals. And so these revolutionary guerrilla movements you're talking about, they certainly learn from one another. It's not clear that the major powers that were attempting counterinsurgency against those guerrillas really understood that they couldn't win by conventional means, right? It's kind of the Vietnam
hearts and minds dilemma. And that really is the message of the film when you think about it, right? Because the Battle of Algiers, as a specific segment of the Algerian struggle for independence, the 54 to 57 period, ends in defeat of the Algerians, clearly. But then by the end of the film, what do you see? In 1962, they get their independence. So the French win these tactical battles, but they lose the war because they don't see the larger meaning of the war.
And I'll talk for a minute about the other part of the question, which was about the $800,000 budget. That is a modest, impressively modest budget for a film of this scope, but there are a couple things that helped that money go further. One is shooting on location. Hollywood for decades avoided shooting on location because of the cost, and that was a cost that primarily would have translated or resulted in time and mostly in the expense of creating the Hollywood aesthetic on location. Here, by shooting on location the actual parts of Algiers where these events took place, they're not building any sets, they're not paying much at all any of the extras, the cast of thousands, and they're not worried because of the documentary aesthetic of creating a specific look much beyond making sure the events are clear enough to be observed, to be seen. In addition, two more points that are that are particular to the fact that this is an Italian film and that Pontecorvo is an Italian filmmaker, that probably helped the budget. One is he was well aware of the long tradition of Italian neorealist filmmakers, Vittorio De Sica, Roberto Rossellini. I think in particularly you can see the influence of a movie like Rome Open City in this movie. And that film movement, which interestingly is the topic of this week's Ask Andrew video, if you want to learn more about it, always shot on location, used amateur actors. It was really guerrilla filmmaking, not to make a pun, but it was guerrilla filmmaking, which by its nature is less expensive. The last thing I would say, and this is true at this point in the 60s of many European cinemas, but Italian cinema is most known for and does it, I think, for the longest. None of the sound is captured on location, right? The whole entire movie is dubbed. Even if it's Italians speaking Italian for Italians, Italian cinema is dubbed. They do the sound separately. And when you are always going to go back in and add the sound for everything, you can film on location much more quickly and much more efficiently. So I'm not saying any of this to, minimize the efficiency or skill of the filmmakers, but to give a bit of context as to just, some of the circumstances that would have facilitated this movie being made on that budget. Let's see, Joss, you have a question or comment?
Sure. Well, I first saw this film when it was relatively new, about 50 years ago, and was just amazed by it. And having not seen it for 50 years, it's still a just spectacular, breathtaking piece of work. I wanted to also give thanks to Paul for that wonderful introductory video. It was just so full of context and the historical context and the film context. So I really want to express my gratitude for that. I think we all should.
Thank you.
You're welcome. There's an overarching theme here which comes to mind, which is influence. Both this film having been influenced certainly by the Italian Neorealism movement. I wonder, and just see what you think, if it goes back even farther to something like the battleship Potemkin from 30 or 40 years earlier than this film. It had that same sort of impact in another era. Another thing that came to mind was the use of these real feeling crowd scenes which led to the disclaimer of no newsreel footage. And it's been used in all sorts of ways, not just in something as serious as this. I recently saw Dr. Strangelove, and there are some scenes in Dr. Strangelove, the battle scenes, the military attack on the airbase, that felt like newsreel footage, just like this did.
Mhm.
And another one that came to mind, and this was just came to me out of left field, was A Hard Day's Night, and the crowd scenes of screaming teens going after the Beatles in a film of much different tone. So that was one thought. And yet the influence of this film goes on even to something as recently as Saving Private Ryan, and the first half hour on the Normandy Beach battlefield that felt almost as real as this did. Paul, you mentioned that the State Department had shown this in the early 2000s. I had read that also. I also read that some insurgent organizations have used this as not exactly a training film, but certainly as an influence. The IRA and the Intifada and any number of insurgent movements have seen this film almost as a guide. Anyway, those were some of my thoughts, and I'd love to hear your comments.
Lots to think about there. I agree with you. It's a film that has been returned to by folks on all sides of the political spectrum, ranging from insurgency to counterinsurgency. People feel there is a lesson to be gleaned from the film to this day, aside from the fact of it just being a great film. You mentioned, and so too I think did Andrew in his remarks a bit earlier, the documentary aesthetic of the film and its abiding influence going forward. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. But I think you're also right to look back to something like Eisenstein and Battleship Potemkin. Not that these are identical aesthetics, I'm not claiming that, but there was something unapologetically political about the documentary aesthetic of Eisenstein and others that I think does influence Italian neorealism and does influence Battle of Algiers. In the case of our film in particular, I think I said this in my recorded remarks, the film clearly is on the side ultimately of the Algerians. I don't think the film pulls any punches about that, even though it sort of shows the cool veneer of the French as embodied by the Colonel Mathieu, Jean Martin's character. There is a kind of attraction there, I suppose, but ultimately the film's sentiments are very much with the Algerians and their struggle for independence. The film does, I think, try to look at both sides as even-handedly as possible when it comes to matters of civilian casualties and violence. I do think the film is trying to be honest about the cost paid on both sides, the moral cost paid on both sides. But ultimately, the arc of history trends towards this liberation movement, and the film doesn't apologize for that. I also like that you mentioned films that aren't very political, that nonetheless draw on this aesthetic, like Hard Day's Night. You couldn't think of a more different film in many important ways, but I know where you're coming from when you say that. In terms of a contemporary influence, I'm going to pick something from television and not from movies for a moment, and that's David Simon's The Wire. And Simon has acknowledged that among his many, many, many influences on that show, Battle of Algiers is among them, because it shows a city under siege and a people oppressed by state authority. And if you go back and watch any episode of The Wire, there is a kind of documentary aesthetic at work in that show that I think owes a great debt to this film. And that's merely one example. I'm sure we can think of others. Andrew, did you want to add anything? Or?
Yeah, I think the comparison to Potemkin is an important one. I think in terms of being a no holds barred political film, in terms of being a depiction of oppression, but the schools of filmmaking are very different. I think the thing that is shared by them is the desire and the attempt to get at some type of social realism. And Pontecorvo is doing that by basically sort of creating a "you are there" aesthetic and a sense of immediacy. And Eisenstein was doing that more by getting you to feel the impact of what was happening, but doing it in a very structured and stylized way. I think one link they have in common is the use of a lot of non-actors and the casting. When Eisenstein did it, it was called typage, of saying, I need people who convey this just by the look of them. Mm-hmm. And you see some of that in Algiers as well. But I think that even if the only thing Pontecorvo, well, he took it from the Neorealists, but even if the only thing the Neorealists took was the idea that movies could be, feature films could be used for political commentary, was certainly something they didn't get from Hollywood, right? So there's certainly a lineage there.
So just to build for a moment on what you're saying, Andrew, and I don't know the answer to this, it's just a question that's coming into my head. There is a kind of genetic connection to Eisenstein. I think we agree that's there, but there are important differences as well. And one of the key hallmarks of Eisenstein's technique, right, is the use of montage, which many criticize. The French film critic André Bazin famously said that made horrible cinema because montage was fundamentally manipulative in any kind of film, but particularly in a political film, deeply manipulative and dishonest. I don't know that I agree with that, but I would like to compare, and I don't know the answer here, I'd like to compare the relative reliance on montage in Battle of Algiers and any film of Eisenstein's. And that might be an instructive exercise at some point to see if one errs on the side of use of that technique more than another. I guess Eisenstein, simply because he was just so in love with it and basically invented the modern form of it. But I don't know the answer.
Well, I think Eisenstein, I think in Potemkin, he's using it in his other films, but we'll use Potemkin as the best and most well-known example. He's using it on a micro level. I mean, yeah. He is going moment by moment, setting up, 3-shot blocks, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That synthesis then becomes anew. Here, I think in part because of the nature and structure of the film, that opportunity wouldn't exist for Pontecorvo and his colleagues if they wanted it to, because it's rare that you have direct interaction between the characters we associate with the colonel and whatnot and the militants, right? You have sort of unnamed police officers interacting with them, but it really is sort of parallel tracks of a story that kind of intersect and then come apart and then intersect and come apart, sort of like Heat in a way. Yeah. And so that sort of micro version or small version, moment by moment version of montage wouldn't have worked in this movie anyway. But on a grander scale, on a broader scale, you do have things like, the death of police, a sequence or a scene with a death, that results in the death of a police officer. And then you cut to what that results in the military then doing, and on and on and on. And in a sense, that's what Eisenstein was doing, just on a moment by moment level, not on a sort of, a grander, level of the struggle. So in that sense, they do share an approach. It's just a matter of sort of scope and frequency of application, I think.
I really like your observation here, because you're reminding us, right, that a sequence like in Potemkin, right, of the Odessa Steps, right, kind of the most infamous sequence from that film, is a perfect example, right, of a direct encounter between the two opposing forces, an asymmetrical encounter, a brutal encounter, right? But the Cossacks mow everybody down. But it's precisely what you're talking about. Compare that to Algiers, where the relative number of moments like that is far less, in part because of the different era and the different battle tactics being deployed, the bombing of each other's communities in the middle of the night or in the middle of the day, the resolute insistence on not closing with the enemy unless absolutely necessary. And the one time the Battle of Algiers breaks with that distancing, if you will, between the sides in conflict is the scenes of torture, which are the most intimate scenes in the film, sadly, right? The most heartbreaking and intimate scenes in the film, where combatants are face to face and their relative inhumanity to each other is fully on display. And maybe takes us back to the Eisenstein Odessa Steps for a moment.
Well, in the Odessa Steps sequence, one of those parties, the townspeople don't even know they're in a fight, right? When it starts.
Exactly.
And in a way, that's sort of what the police are like in the beginning of Algiers, because they're not on guard at all for these, for the killings of individual officers. And it seems very one-sided at that moment in favor of the insurgents, but that obviously doesn't stay the case for long. But it's to compare the films is, we could do that for another hour. So
Yeah.
We'll, instead of talking about a movie a lot of people probably haven't seen, let's go to some more questions as much as I'm enjoying it. Robert, you have a question or comment?
Oh, yes, thanks. So we all agree then that this film falls squarely in the tradition of Italian neorealism, I would think. Is that correct? Or do you think that it varies in some way from Italian neorealism as practiced by, say, Vittorio De Sica or Rossellini?
Well, I think. Go ahead.
And I just want to follow up with just one other thing about the music. I thought the music was a Mortasconi score. I think he did other music for the Italian neorealists. So I was wondering if you could compare the use of music in this film to the use of music in other Italian neorealism.
Thanks, Robert. I think that one way this movie differs from sort of what's thought of as the more conventional neorealist film. I wouldn't call this necessarily a neorealist film, not because it doesn't have neorealist elements, but because I would say that there are other aesthetics and other thematic goals or interests that would define it more strongly. But one of those differences is I think of neorealist films, and it's not true across the board, but I think of them having more sentiment to them, and I think of them being more tied to individuals. That's certainly not universally the case, but I think that there's an extent to which in some of those movies, it's about an individual surviving in the world, an individual in certain circumstances. And even though we focus on some individuals in this movie, it's really not about the individuals much at all. Paul, any thoughts on that question?
No, not much to add there. I think you're right. The film has neorealism DNA in it for sure. And Pontecorvo was the first to admit that. He greatly admired Rossellini and company. For me, one of the things that defines a difference, perhaps, in comparison to, say, Rome Open City, which is easy pickings here. But in that film, you have the obvious villain, in the Nazis to resist. And while that's a morally complex film, and it raises questions about what the resistance in Rome is willing to do and what price they're willing to pay to fight the Nazis, there's no question that the Nazis are a problem and that they need to be fought. That's not how everyone in Algiers views it, right? There are Algerians who are making their peace with French domination. There are French who have been living for generations in Algeria, the so-called Blackfeet, right? They were called simply meaning that they had their feet on the ground, right? That for generations they had made Algeria their home and they viewed it as part of France, literally and legally and in every other way. So there were, in a certain sense, more complexities even in this situation. And it's also an interesting thing to have an Italian leftist filmmaker making a film very critical of France, in the post-war environment, and sort of suggesting pretty clearly that the people who had led the French resistance were now the people oppressing Algerians and others abroad. And so the moral and ideological messaging of this film, I think this is what Andrew was getting at, right, is much messier. And that messiness is embraced by the film. One thing the film does not engage, and I suggested this in the video, it doesn't cover the whole of the 54 to 62 struggle, nor does it pretend to, nor could it probably. One thing that is definitely left out is the town-country divide or the urban-rural divide within the FLN. There were serious disagreements over goals and methods and priorities and equipment and logistics between the forces of the Kasbah that we see in the movie and everyone else in Algeria and the hinterlands who are also struggling in their own way and feel in many ways like they're playing second fiddle to the leaders in Algiers. That isn't really explored at all. So there are plenty of complexities the film does get at, plenty it doesn't have time for. You had mentioned the music. I don't want to skip that. I mean, Morricone has scored for just about everybody. We lost him this year, I believe. Huge loss, arguably the greatest film composer ever, certainly in the Mount Rushmore of film composers. And I think the score, as some of you I think were saying in the typed comments, the score is all about building suspense. It's all about building tension. It also is a score that's very melancholy and reflective and meditative when the carnage happens, right? When the bombs go off and civilians are dead on either side. There's this beautiful scoring that's meant to make you reflect on all that. So for all the kinetic energy of the score, it also knows when to pull back and be quiet. Keep in mind too, it was a score collaborated on by Pontecorvo and Morricone. So they collectively made the score what it is.
Ed, do you have a question or comment? Ed Katz, are you there? Okay, then we will go to Richard Chait.
Thank you. I had first seen the movie when I was in college, and as it happened, I reviewed movies for the Temple News back in the 60s. The one scene that sums up the movie to me is when the French colonel speaks with the press. When I first saw it, the line he said was, "Why are the liberals always on the wrong side?" Which, at least on the translation I saw, changed it about Sartre. But I think that sums it up because the press didn't understand what the army was doing, and the army didn't understand what was happening with the press and back in France. Any comments?
Well, I thought it was interesting. Something he said in the press conference was, he didn't put it this way, but the way he phrased a retort to one of the reporters was, sort of basically, if we agree that, France should be in Algeria, this is the way to do it. So to me, he's sort of acknowledging there that, there are other choices that could be made that would head off what the military is doing. But if that's the charge that France has decided, the course France has decided upon at that moment, then he's doing his job, and he didn't appreciate basically being sort of criticized about how he was doing it. He didn't decide, he didn't set policy. And that's something you see, this movie, for the first time I saw it, I've seen it several times. It reminded me watching it this time of, I think, a very underseen and underrated movie from the 90s made by Ed Zwick called The Siege, that has Denzel Washington and Annette Bening. And it's made in this interesting time after the first World Trade Center bombing in the early 90s, but before September 11th. And it's not the same movie as Algiers, but it engages with a lot of the same issues. And you have similar themes come up in that. And I think that, I think that that's the closest, that's at that, in a way, that's sort of the most sympathetic the military comes across, reminding people that someone had to send them there and give them that job to do.
The other thing is that I was in the Army for 3 years. I didn't fight in combat, but as an Army person, you don't have free will. You're under the control of the government. The government sends you there to do a job. You don't have a lot of options. If this doesn't work, you can do that. But your main job basically was to put down the rebellion. And you could put it down this way, or you can be very brutal and torture the people. But you had to achieve the goal. Whether the goal was a good goal or a bad goal, you cannot question that as being a military person.
Right. Thank you, Richard. Paul, did you have thoughts on these topics?
Yeah, just briefly, I understand the pressure any combat soldier, or even someone who hasn't seen combat, right? Any pressure that a soldier feels from the weight of state authority and military authority in particular to achieve particular goals. That said, in the period depicted in the film, we are talking about a world that is post-Geneva Convention, post-creation of the United Nations, post the discourse of human rights that really took off in the wake of the horrors of World War II. So there are ways of saying no to particular kinds of orders that you might deem immoral or even illegal by international law. Now, the price you pay for saying no, that's a whole other question. And being in the moment, it could be very difficult to say no. I think, though, that what the film is exposing is the ultimately faulty logic behind Colonel Mathieu's argument to the press and the media there. He's thinking of this as a military equation. And to solve a military equation, you apply certain kinds of pressure and leverage, including violence, and from his point of view, including torture. And that will get you the result you seek. But that's a fundamental failure to understand, right? That this is not solely or simply a military matter. And that in essence, what the military has been asked to do in Algiers is to play the role of the police. And we've certainly heard a lot about this in the last year, right? Anytime the police become militarized, or anytime the military is asked to take on police functions, it's usually a recipe for disaster. And what does it end up getting the French? The exact opposite of what they thought they wanted, right? They don't get to keep Algeria.
Well, and it's interesting because he actually makes an aside when early on, one of the first scenes where we see the colonel and he's briefing, I guess, his lieutenants or whatever, he says, I'm going to use a term that many of us don't care for, but we have to, when we are policing this zone or whatever. And so there's some awareness, although obviously not enough, but there's some awareness that there's a conflict there.
Yeah, and maybe in his quiet moments, he'd be the first to say, this is
Right.
the last thing I want to be doing, right? This
Right.
is not what a soldier does.
Ed, Katz, are you there with your question or comment? I see you're unmuted, Ed. Go ahead and talk. Ed? Okay. Sorry, Ed, we don't hear you. I'm not sure what's happening, but we will move on to Dana. Dana just
Can
went
you hear
away.
me?
Oh, yes,
No,
now
I
we
am.
can. Go ahead, Dana.
All right, I want to go in a different direction if I might.
Sure.
Sure.
Good. I want to talk about some of the, first of all, Paul, the introduction was, as others have said, just terrific. And I've seen this movie before, studied it with Andrew. It was great then, but you brought some wonderful new things in that I hadn't thought about. So thanks for that. I want to talk about the storytelling. I want to go smaller and talk about some things that I noticed that made this, to me, just so brilliant in terms of story. The first was the series of scenes with the women preparing the bombs. And I just was amazed by how beautifully that was telling us what was going on in terms of what was starting with the way they prepared themselves with their hair, which is something that's so interesting to many women, how they lightened their hair to change their appearance. I just thought that was so brilliantly done. Saul, could you go in the other room? I'm sorry. And then moving on to the scene where they were wiring the bombs and how the women stood there and watched that and following those three incredibly wonderful faces. I thought that the choice of those actresses or non-actresses was just great. Just looking at the way they looked. One of them, I think, was the bride earlier in the movie. But I just thought that was just a wonderful way of seeing how a smaller part of the big picture. And I want to talk a little bit about sort of the undercurrent of the music. It wasn't really music, but I'll wait and do that later. So that's the first thing. I just thought those scenes were great. The second thing I wanted to mention that I thought was really terrific was the use of children in this movie. I thought that they were not exploited, and it's easy to exploit children in war stories. And I thought where they fit in, there was one character that he reminded me of sort of like Gavroche, Les Mis, kind of, the street urchin kind of kid. Then there were just other children that mostly boys, I think, or maybe all boys. And I just thought the use of the children and how this whole thing was impacting them and from a film storytelling point was just great. The little boy that the woman with the bomb had to sort of deposit off with somebody in order to move on. Some of them we saw, full face, some of them we didn't, but there were lots of children, groups of children. I just thought the use of children in this movie was great. And the third thing I want to mention is, and we've touched on the soundtrack. It was, of course, brilliant, but I think it was even more than that. I saw the soundtrack as sort of another, Paul, I think you mentioned the Greek chorus idea of the characters. I think I saw the music as almost a Greek chorus. There were three elements to the music and the soundtrack that I really thought were amazing. First was the music that I think you mentioned, which I felt was very spiritual, that was played out during the carnage scenes, and it was just, it took your breath away to hear that music, and then just seeing the images. It was certainly commenting on those images. Secondly, there was, and this was kind of going back to the scene with the women, there were some points where there was kind of a drum beat and a bass line where the tension was mounting, which I thought was really well placed. It certainly upped the ante a lot for us when we watched it. And the third, and I don't know if it's music or soundtrack or how you want to call it, and I don't even know how to pronounce it. It's those ululations that the women, the very specific sound of those women. It's cultural. It's eerie. It's transcendent. And I thought where they were placed in the movie, particularly at the end of the movie, sort of in a celebratory way, was just so special. So those are the three areas. I mean, there's so many, but those are the three that I just wanted to pick out to say that the brilliance of this movie isn't just the large parts of the movie, but just smaller things too, that I just think were done so well.
Andrew, did you want to jump in first?
Sure. I'll talk a little bit about the casting. That you're absolutely right, Dana. Casting is often an unsung part of many movies, and only in the last 10 years did casting directors get a branch in the Motion Picture Academy. They still do not have an award for casting, though a number of filmmakers have advocated for it. The thing that Eisenstein got, the thing that Pontecorvo obviously gets from seeing this movie, and lots of other filmmakers do, though I don't know how many though not as many as should, and certainly not all viewers get, is that film is visual communication, right? And you have a short period of time, if you're trying to do your best work, to convey a lot of information. And I don't necessarily mean just information rationally and logically, but emotional information and plot information, all that stuff. If you cast someone who looks a certain way, then that's a great use of shorthand. And Hollywood got this with stars, right? You put John Wayne in a movie, you put Marilyn Monroe in a certain part, you know, the audience gets a whole lot more about that character than was ever put into the exposition of the screenplay, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the same is true for smaller characters and smaller parts, but not everybody pays attention or makes the effort there. I think this film does that because, with a few exceptions, it's all smaller parts, and it's essential that particularly on the FLN side, this seems to be very much up from the people, much of an organic thing. And so, you know, the best filmmakers pay attention to these things. Not all of them do, but clearly Pontecorvo did here. Paul.
Yeah, I think Andrew, you're spot on with this attention to detail in casting every part, including and maybe most especially the non-speaking roles. I mean, faces matter. I mean, what is the great line in Sunset Boulevard, right? Back in the day of the silence, we had faces then, right? Well, we always have faces. We need faces. And a filmmaker like Pontecorvo will pay attention to that. And I think Dana's remarks about the use of women in the film, incredibly compelling performances there, particularly in the bombing scene, but even beyond it. And also the use of children. And I would extend that to young people in general. Let's remember that Ali Lapointe, based on a real figure, right, started out as a thief and became one of the great martyrs of the independence movement. He's the guy we meet at the beginning and end of the film, right, who's going to end up dead at the hands of the French. He's basically a child himself, and a lost child who finds some kind of focus and dignity being part of this movement. So I think you're absolutely right that this is not simply a film for one or two actors and not just for male actors. This is a film that celebrates the lives and the faces and the stories of an entire city full of people. And it goes back to what Andrew said earlier about the advantage of shooting on location here. You not only have real people and real faces to draw on, you have real people who lived through the actual events, right? This film is made not that long after Algerian independence and not that long after the period depicted in the film. And many of the people involved, including at least one of the women that I know of, were members of the movement, were members of the FLN. So it's kind of the ultimate perfect kind of stunt casting, if you will. As far as the music, I'm glad you agree with me that there's something of a chorus or choral element in the film. And I think the music really drives that home, and particularly the varying uses of music. And you've already pointed them out, the ululation in particular, which closes the film, right? It's important, I think, that the film closes on the powerful voices of women, which suggests that it took a lot more than men playing war games all by their lonesome and by their own rules to actually make the movement succeed.
Ed, are you with us?
Yes, can you hear me this time?
Yes, we can. Go ahead, please.
Yay. Okay, thanks. Thanks so much. I appreciate your patience on struggling with a different system.
No problem.
So first was the first question I had that, but I'll get to other things too. But the question I had was, I know this movie was banned in France initially. When it was finally released there, I'm curious as to what the French public reaction was. So that was one question I had. A comment I wanted to make was about the actor who played Colonel Mathot. I thought he was absolutely phenomenal. He's a man with a tough job. The press conference scene that someone mentioned earlier, I thought was spectacular. He's answering the questions, but he's not answering the questions. But then he asks them, what do you want us to do? You know, how do you want us to do? France wants this country, so we're doing what we need to do. And it reminded me of so many other wartime situations and with governments trying to oppress rebels. And several other situations as well, all around the world. It was startling. And I can understand why the Pentagon used the film in, I think it said 2003 from what I read. But it does show sympathy. And this is a rare thing because documentaries now really don't seem to be balanced like this one. I mean, I think of, Michael Moore, and all his films are very one-sided with his documentaries. This really showed both sides. And I felt some sympathy for Metho because he's a man with a task that he's got to fulfill, and he does it, but obviously there's a lot of drawbacks to how he does it, but he knows that this is the way that will work. So it's very, I thought it really showed both sides very, very well. But I wanted to get back to what the French reaction was as well.
So the French reaction, which I touched on a little bit in the video I made, it wasn't a matter of absolutely ironclad official censorship, but it was de facto censorship. People were afraid to show the film. As I pointed out, at least one theater got firebombed by the OAS, which was kind of the radical keep Algeria at all costs wing of the rightists in France, particularly within the military. So in a scenario like that, you can understand why, an ordinary theater, exhibitor may not want that kind of drama, no matter how interesting or potentially profitable the film might otherwise be. So it took a number of years. It was only in the early 70s that the film started to be screened a little more often than it had been. But still, it wasn't a common occurrence because plenty of folks on the right still thought it was a treasonous depiction of what had happened in Algeria, and that everyone associated with the film, be damned, and that it shouldn't exist. There were folks on the left as well who thought that the film was almost too understanding of the French predicament that you mentioned in your remarks. So for them, they felt, well, this film goes a little too far in that direction. I guess that's proof that you're onto something if you're pushing buttons and annoying both sides.
Both sides, right.
Yeah, and regarding Mathieu, the colonel, he's played by Jean Martin, who had fought in Indochina. This is a guy who had a military record, was a great actor, worked on the stage doing Beckett, signed the manifesto of 121 that Sartre had also signed, basically saying, get out of Algeria now. So he was a professional actor, a military veteran, and a leftist, and being called upon to join this film as the only professional actor in it. And I think his story as an actor, putting the character aside even, really gets at the messiness and complexity of French identity in this period. I mean, think of all the things that guy's life represented. And then he ends up in this film. And Pontecorvo and Martin had they butted heads occasionally, because Pontecorvo was fearful of what a professional actor would do to the aesthetic of the film. He almost felt it was too polished a performance. But I think in retrospect, that character absolutely needed that polish to be the guy that you could realistically imagine coming in and, maybe breaking every ethical rule in the book, but perhaps succeeding where others had failed.
All right.
Thank you. And thanks again for choosing the film. I thought it was a spectacular choice because it was a film I never did get to see. And even when I was a film student trying to see almost everything, and I didn't get it. So getting to see it
finally
now,
seen it. Awesome.
Right. It's a joy. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Let's see. Joan, you have a question or comment?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I too had never seen the film, and I had heard about it for years. I always wanted to see it. And one of the reasons was many years ago when I was in my 20s, I was on a very long trip in Europe, which ended in traveling across North Africa, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, even though I only spent 5 days in Algeria. And I know that North Africa, the whole North Africa was colonized by France, very similar. So, but then Tunisia and Morocco apparently had different ways of becoming independent. So I'd like to hear about that. Also, it showed to me that when you have an armed struggle like the insurgents were doing, In Algeria, it didn't work. And a few years later, it looked to me that it was massive civilian resistance when large numbers of the population came out and demonstrated and so on, mostly nonviolent. And that seems to be much more effective method of gaining independence.
So a couple of things there. I think you're right that the importance and effectiveness of nonviolent action should not be understated. If you think of Gandhi in India, you think of other movements. I've been doing some reading on this recently, and nonviolence has been far more effective than people believe. If you look at the historical record of political change in the 20th and even into the 21st century. That said, I want to be fair to at least the position of the FLN, which is that you wouldn't have had the civilian mobilization to do at least nonviolent resistance if you hadn't had the initial period of violent struggle and martyrdom. That's worth debating, right? Whether that really gets you the result you want or not is a very big question. Your remark about North Africa, I think, is interesting too, because it brings up something I didn't get to talk about in the video. Two things. One would be a film that I sometimes teach as a companion piece to Battle of Algiers is Casablanca. And you might say, well, why do you do that? Well, both are in North Africa. Both deal with colonial situations and peoples to some extent or another, radically different films in every other possible way. And I will say, as much as I love Casablanca, and I thoroughly do, the scene in Rick's Cafe when the Nazis and the supporters of the Allies get into a battle of national anthems and everybody standing up and doing the French anthem eventually and drowning out those Nazis. And it's moving, right? I mean, it's meant to bring you to tears. And remember, Casablanca was made in the middle of the war. So I don't want to undersell that. But that said, that film completely ignores what's going on in Morocco and really doesn't ask much about how Moroccans feel about all this and how for them the difference between one oppressor and another might be harder to see all the time. This film does something very different, right? It makes you think through the experience and look through the eyes of the Algerians. So I think the two films make an interesting double feature if you want to have some debates. The other thing I wanted to mention that I didn't in the video is, and this is something Sadi Youssef has talked about. He's the guy who plays the leader of the cell in the Kasbah, who recruits Ali Lapointe. And he had, I said in the video, made the original treatment for the story. Never felt he got quite enough credit for that once Pontecorvo and Franco Salinas took over. At any rate, he is still alive today and serving in the equivalent of Congress in Algeria. But one thing he has talked about with some trepidation that you might understand is how radically different a place Algeria and North Africa are today, with the infusion of a very different way of thinking about religion and Islam into the political equation, because you don't really hear much about that in the film, right? It's there as a subtext. And surely it was an important part of the independence movement. I think the film probably doesn't stress that enough. But ultimately, it's a kind of nationalism and liberation ideology that fuels the FLN to independence. And Algeria today is a very, very different place. And the kind of desecularization of places like Algeria is something that old revolutionaries like Sadi Youssef can't quite get their heads around. It's a different world than the one they had. It's revolutionary, arguably, in a different way.
But how did the French leave Tunisia and Morocco, and when?
I don't recall when they left there formally. I mean, Algeria was kind of the last big prize that they gave up, not very willingly, right? I think it happens before Algeria, because there is some movement across the borders that I've read about from places like Tunisia and Morocco, sending equipment and support to the FLN which might not have been possible under French occupation. So those might have already been let go. And the story of how they were let go is something I don't know.
Thank
And
you, Joan.
maybe some of you do.
Thank you, Joan. Let's see. Ed Wiener, do you have a question or comment?
Yeah, just piggybacking on what Paul said a little bit, saw the Criterion version of this, had watched yesterday like an hour-long feature on the history of the Algerian situation in France. They mentioned, and I'm probably going to screw up some of the details here, but sometime in the 50s when they were going about it, maybe like 50% of Algeria actually supported the FLM. Then the FLM did some type of some like terrorist actions, and the French police, while trying to go after them, did a lot of nasty stuff to try to find the people. And in no time, it turned up to like 95% of the Algerian people supported the FLM.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the, I think that's part of the point of the film and the way the film is structured and what the film shows is that there are unintended consequences. And in putting out one fire or stopping one type of behavior or doing what you think will do that, it has ripples that you can win that's why there's the phrase, you can win the battle and lose the war. And that's ultimately, it seems, what the French did.
So the film doesn't show a lot of the divisions within the FLN, some of which I already alluded to earlier, right? The town-country divide, urban-rural divide. But even within the Kasbah, there were huge differences of opinion on what to do next. And that's something the film doesn't really have a ton of time for, but it's worth thinking about, because when you look at figures, which are always estimates, right, of support of the FLN, and then you try to ascertain what's fueling that support, it kind of glosses over the divide within the movement about what they should be and what they should do. And I think this is a question that another film by another French filmmaker gets at really powerfully. If you've ever seen Army of Shadows by Melville, that's all about the French resistance, but boy, does it show the resistance turning on itself within its own ranks in some really ugly ways. And that's a brutal truth about the resistance that got Melville a lot of flack from people who wanted a purely patriotic take on what the French resistance had been. We were all on the same page. We all thought the same way. We all had the same goals. And Melville said, no, I was in the resistance. I know for sure we didn't have the same goals. And there's even the implication in that film that sometimes they killed one another. That's how much they disagreed. That doesn't really come out of this film much. There was one accusation made by a very, I would say, unreliable and self-serving source, General Paul Wright. I'm not really saying his name right. He's one of the models for the colonel character that Jean Martin plays in the film, but a much more unscrupulous guy. Basically got drummed out of the service eventually for admitting that he was behind a lot of the torture and being totally unapologetic about it, right? I did it, I would do it again, it was the right thing to do. And it got him in a lot of trouble. He also suggested that Sadi Youssef, the guy who plays the head of the cell, which he was in real life in the Kasbah, he suggests that Youssef is the one who ratted out Ali Lapointe and led to his death at the hands of the French. There isn't a whole lot of evidence for that, and Youssef denies it vociferously, and I believe him. But by the same token, I bet there were some pretty brutal disagreements within the ranks of the FLN, and they didn't always end in a pretty way. I think that's something you see in any movement, however coherent it might seem.
Thanks. And thanks, Ed, for the question. I think that brings us to the end of our discussion. Thank you all for attending. We have some other offerings coming up. Paul is teaching a seminar on the very influential and insightful and funny sitcom The Office later this month. We have other remote classroom seminars coming up. And of course, we have our discussions continuing every Monday. Please visit brynmarfilm.org, go to the Film Studies Online section, sign up for our emails every Thursday. If you don't get our emails now, when you do, you will get a notice of what the film for the following Monday is and a link to the instructor's introduction, which is always must-see viewing. In addition,
can I tag
Sure.
on to that for 1 minute, Andrew?
Sure.
I just want to encourage you all to consider supporting BMFI in any way that you can. I know many of you do already, and if you can't further, we understand in these trying times. But if there is a way for you to help in whatever capacity, we really would appreciate it, because I think when we're live and in person, which I think is the ideal version of BMFI, and I look forward to getting back to that, it's unbeatable in terms of what it brings to our community in terms of film education and cultural discussion. I love doing these things. I learn so much from them, from all of you. And we're doing the best we can to replicate that online. And I think we've done a pretty good job overall. I know we get Zoom fatigue. I know we have screen fatigue. And yet people keep coming back to these discussions. So if these have been of value to you, please consider supporting BMFI in any way that you can. Thank you.
Well, thanks for those remarks, Paul, and thank you. Speaking of keeping coming back, you keep coming back. You have since March to share with us your selections of really thought-provoking films and to share your insights about them. And you're really one of the people that, if BMFI is an indispensable resource or something approaching it, you're one of the reasons why. And we very much appreciate your participation tonight, as all the other nights. So, and I know that you're going to be back with us a couple times in the coming month. So that will be a wonderful treat for us all, with some very different movies. So that'll be great too, but we're not going to spoil what they are yet. People will have to wait for that Thursday email. Until then, until our next email, thanks very much for joining us, everyone. Thank you, Paul, for joining us, of course, and we look forward to seeing you soon through BMFI, either in Theater 5, our virtual hub, or one of these days, we're working on it in person. Take care, everybody.
Can't wait to see you live.
Take care.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you so much.
Paul.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.